All right, we're filming this one without any notes because we're in ideal filming conditions. That being Friday night, no food and no sleep. So let's go. I want to talk a little bit about the word and the idea of the Apocrypha because this is one of those confusing concepts that a lot of people have half an idea of what it means, but don't really have a full understanding of what the term refers to. Most of the confusion comes from the fact that the word Apocrypha is bandied around by some people to mean a particular collection of books whose authenticity was debated in the ancient church, and other people use them to refer to basically any book that looks like it belongs in the Bible but was eventually not included in it. And technically, these are both justifiable uses of the term apocrypha. The word apocrypha is just the plural of the Greek word apokryphon, which means hidden or obscure. Now, like I said earlier, there's typically two different references that people have in mind when they talk about the apocrypha, and some people don't know the difference between the two of them and assume that they're the same. So the first referent is something that's also called the Deuterocanon. This is the list of 7 books and several different additions to other books of the Old Testament whose authenticity and place in the canon of Scripture was debated among the early Christians. The other possible referent to the concept of Apocrypha is any collection of books that don't belong in the Bible, which is a very low resolution way of looking at it, but it's helpful nonetheless. This video is going to talk about the former category, the deuterocanonical Apocrypha. We'll bracket the other Apocrypha for a later video because, trust me, it's complicated, but we'll get to that eventually. So today we're going to be talking about the first category of Apocrypha, the deuterocanonical Apocrypha. Now, if you can't guess by my choice of words, I prefer the term Deuterocanon to Apocrypha when I'm describing this collection of books because it's a little bit more precise and it helps us to understand what we're talking about here. The Deuterocanonical Apocrypha are a collection of 7 books whose authenticity and place in Scripture were disputed by the ancient church. Essentially, the process of deciding which books belong in the Bible, since all 66 books of the Bible were originally their own separate books among many other books in antiquity, the process of determining which books belong in the Bible was a long and arduous one. There was never one decision where the church came together and nailed down this is the official list of Scripture and anything outside of it doesn't belong. It was a long, rolling process that lasted several hundred years. And along the way, there were a lot of discussions about what belongs in Scripture and what doesn't. A lot of books that are currently in Scripture were disputed by some people, like the book of Revelation, the book of Hebrews, etc. And a lot of books that aren't currently in the canon of Scripture were also considered authentic by some ancient church fathers. So the deuterocanonical apocrypha occupy a very odd place and a very gray space in the history of this discourse. Now, the deuterocanonical apocrypha particularly refer to 7 books and several other versions of existing books of the Old Testament that were considered for inclusion by some ancient church fathers and were rejected by others. These books were considered for inclusion by some ancient church fathers because they were found among manuscripts of the Old Testament. When these Greek Christians came to Greek translations of the Old Testament, they very frequently found these books among the other books of the Old Testament that we're familiar with, like Genesis and Exodus and Isaiah and so on and so forth. Those who rejected the inclusion of the deuterocanonical apocrypha usually refer to the fact that the Jewish people who wrote the Old Testament don't consider them to be canonical. St. Jerome is a great example of this, the man who translated the Old Testament from Hebrew into Latin in the Latin-speaking West, did not consider the Deuterocanon to be canonical in his own time, although he later changed his mind at the Pope's behest. Now, this discussion got pretty heated at various points in church history, but a couple people decided to save the balance and split the middle, like Athanasius of Alexandria, who's more famous for his words and activities at the Council of Nicaea. Athanasius's response to the question of canon was to consider these books to be useful for reading within churches. They could be read during church services, they could be read by Christians, but not considering them scripture. And this method was followed by several other church fathers as well. So essentially, there were 3 different philosophies for looking at the deuterocanonical apocrypha available in the ancient world. One was to consider them canonical, just like the other books of the Bible. One was to consider them non-canonical, like the books that weren't selected for inclusion. And the other was to say they're not canonical, but we still want to read them regularly in churches today. And what's intriguing is that all 3 of these philosophies still survive today among different forms of Western Christianity. So, for instance, the Roman Catholic Church went with the idea that all of these deuterocanonical books are fully canonical. Just like Genesis and Isaiah, there's no difference between canon and deuterocanon except perhaps in name. Whereas on the Protestant side, most Protestants don't consider these books to be canonical at all. In fact, they're regarded with suspicion, just like any other books that aren't included in the canon of Scripture. Some high church Protestants, these being Protestant churches, but those which nevertheless retain a lot of their Catholic heritage, such as Anglicans and high church Lutherans, consider these books to be in the deuterocanonical status, similar to how Athanasius looked at them. That's to say, they can be read in their churches, they can be read by Christians, but they don't enjoy the status of canonicity. They take the whole not considering Anakin Skywalker to be a Jedi Master approach. So, what exactly are these 7 books? Let's dive into each one of them just a little bit here. Ooh, I'm starting to get twitchy. We'll see if I can finish this before I need to go get food. Rather conveniently, the 7 books of the deuterocanonical Apocrypha can be divvied up into 3 basic categories. So, 1st and 2nd Maccabees are 2 historical or quasi-historical works of history. You guessed it. They're basically relaying information and sometimes exaggerations about historical events that took place during the Maccabean Revolution. We also have 2 books that are novels in nature. These are the books of Judith and the book of Tobit. So these 2 books are narrative documents, but they don't seem to be designed to relay historical information so much as they do purely literary, novelistic information. Finally, we have 2 books of wisdom, the Wisdom of Sirach and the Wisdom of Solomon. Those who have read the book of Proverbs and the book of Ecclesiastes from the Old Testament are going to be familiar with these. These are pretty similar to what we find in Old Testament wisdom literature and in other ancient Israelite wisdom literature that we've recovered from the ancient world. Finally, number 7 is the book of Baruch. Baruch technically fits into the category of wisdom literature, but it's a little bit more complicated than that, and we'll talk about it in a second here. Now, like I said, 1st and 2nd Maccabees are ancient historical documents, primarily. They're trying to relay information about the historical events behind the Maccabean Revolution in the 2nd century BC. This was a situation where the Jewish people threw off the shackles of their Greek overlords and declared independence, and they succeeded in that for about 100 years. So 1st Maccabees, which was written during the Maccabean period, tells us the story of basically how all of this happened. 2nd Maccabees, rather than being a continuation of 1st Maccabees, is actually an account of many of the same details as 1st Maccabees from a different author. So instead of getting one continuous story from 1st Maccabees to 2nd Maccabees, you're actually getting 2 different authors' opinions and perspectives on the same general set of events. Moving to the novels, we have Judith and Tobit. Now, I'm going to be totally honest with you. I actually haven't read Judith through in its entirety. And the reason for that is because it's like 14 chapters long, and Judith only shows up in chapter 8. Like, we get 7 chapters of build-up, talking about how bad the Persians are, because it's set during the Persian period. And then Judith shows up. And by the time I hit chapter 6, I was just kind of like, can I just move on from here? And that was years ago, and I've just never picked it up again. So I apologize. But I've heard it's great. The historical setup wouldn't be a problem if there were actual history. The problem is it is a novel. So it's the equivalent of reading Tolstoy, which I'm not a huge fan of. I've tried it. It's just not for me, Russian literature. Oh, we forgot Tobit. So the Book of Tobit is actually one of my favorite books of the ancient world, and that just goes in general. Like, of canonical books of scripture, non-canonical books of the ancient world, I just like the Book of Tobit. It's a great story. It's a story about love and demons and finding gold in Persia and all sorts of fun stuff like that. Definitely worth the read. Less dry than the first half of Judith, I would have to say. And what's interesting is that Tobit is actually a great blend of different ancient literary genres. It's a novel. It's designed to be a novel and to convey literary information rather than historical information. But what's interesting is that the author also finds ways of weaving in wisdom literature, like what you'd find in Sirach or the Wisdom of Solomon or Proverbs, weaving that into the narrative. So Tobit's father, Tobias, trust me, it's a whole thing, gives him information and wisdom before he sets off on this long journey, accompanied by a mysterious stranger to marry a princess and save her from a demon. It's a whole thing. So definitely read Tobit, but it's a very good story. All right, wisdom literature. We got complicated and we got more complicated. We'll start with the complicated and move on to more complicated. Any questions? No, good. So complicated, we got the Wisdom of Solomon. Wisdom of Solomon is a great book. It's about, let's see, what's the best way of putting this? It's Hellenized Greek Jewish wisdom literature from 1st century BC Alexandria. And if that doesn't get you excited, then I don't know what will. Holy cow, where's all this energy coming from? I am in a fasting state right now. So, Wisdom of Solomon, great book. It's one of the most insightful Hellenistic period and early Roman period Jewish meditations on topics like immortality, justice, life after death, and living in the world itself. Without digging into wisdom theology in general, which I'm going to do in a future video, it's hard to talk about the contents of the Book of Wisdom, but essentially it's a very mature, if albeit Hellenized, way of looking at the Jewish wisdom tradition from a late Greek and early Roman perspective. You'll have to read it for yourself, but it's really, really good. More complicated is the Book of Sirach. I'll leave off the textual criticism angle of it because that is unbelievably complicated, trust me. But Sirach is long because it's complicated in part because it's long. It's 52 chapters in length plus a little prologue that was added. So this is a collection of wisdom that's probably closest to the book of Proverbs because it's the collections of the sayings of a wise sage. In this case, Yehoshua, the son of Sirach, whose wisdom was recorded by his son, and then that son had a son who translated the wisdom into Greek a generation later. I told you it's complicated. Don't even get me started. But essentially, it's 52 chapters of rolling proverbs, which can get a little bit dry at times, but there's actually some really good stuff in there. And it sort of culminates in this great hall of faith in a way that's similar to some of the passages of the New Testament, like Hebrews 11, where it just kind of goes through all these great examples of faithful people from the biblical narratives and even from history, some parts that aren't even discussed in the Bible itself. So Sirach is very important for certain reasons. It's a little bit harder to access if you're just looking for a casual read, so bear that in mind. And finally, there's the book of Baruch. So, like I said, technically qualifies as a wisdom document, but it's got some narrative framing that sort of makes it a narrativized wisdom in a sense. This is the only one that claims to be written by someone who didn't actually write it, which would make it a pseudepigraphon. So it claims to be written by a person named Baruch. Baruch is the historical person who was the scribe of Jeremiah back in the 600s and 500s BC. Now, this document was probably written around 100 or BC or 100 AD. So it can't have been written by the person Baruch, but they're sort of putting on the mask of the scribe Baruch, the scribe of the prophet, to sort of add flavor to the words that they're writing within. And it's primarily wisdom. So it's conveying wisdom information to its readers, but it's pointed wisdom. The whole point is basically saying, hey, we went into exile in Babylon because we messed up. If we don't stop messing up soon, worse things are going to happen. When are we going to come to our senses and actually stop messing up for once? It's a little book. It's a complicated book because originally all of the different chapters were probably originally independent. So somebody grafted them all together into this rather beautiful amalgam of wisdom, essentially, at a later point, and then stitched it to the book of Jeremiah for some reason, which just gets even more complicated. So that's Baruch. Confusing, yes. Good to read, also, yes, I would say. But it doesn't stop there. We got 2 for the price of 1. Not only do we get 7 books that were originally not in the Bible, now in the Bible, but we also get additions to books that are in the Bible. So essentially, there's a couple of books in the Old Testament that have expanded versions of them in the apocryphal or deuterocanonical manuscripts of the Old Testament, to put things simply. So essentially, the book of Esther is a great example of this. Esther in the Old Testament is a little bit peculiar. The text critical history of it is crazy. We're not doing that today. But some people throughout history have noted it's strange that, for one, the book of Esther never mentions God. Although God's people are saved from certain doom in the book of Esther, it doesn't explicitly say that God is doing this. There's also a couple other narrative plot holes and certain things that kind of don't make sense in the text itself. So at some point, somebody wrote additions to the book of Esther that incorporate God more explicitly into the story and also explain some of the plot holes and sort of make the plot work together a little bit better. So in deuterocanonical versions of the book of Esther, you get sort of a more filled out narrative and a filled out story. Whereas in the non-deuterocanonical versions of it, that's going to be in most Protestant Bibles, you get the more basic form of the book of Esther. Both are interesting, both are important, but if you're really into the book of Esther, read them both side by side, see what you think. There's also a third version of the book of Esther, but again, we're not going there today. There's also additions to the book of Jeremiah, and I'm cheating a little bit here because Baruch is typically counted as an addition to Jeremiah rather than being a book in and of itself, but I think it's substantive enough to count as its own. But there is another edition that usually gets put on the end of Baruch. So Jeremiah, Baruch, this book, which is called the Epistle of Jeremiah. This is a 1-chapter prophetic wisdom text which claims to be written by Jeremiah, even though it wasn't. It happened a lot in the ancient world. We'll talk about it. But it's a good read. I don't know what else to say. Read it. It's 1 chapter. Then there's the additions to Daniel. So the cool thing about the book of Daniel is it's easily divided into 2 parts. The first half of Daniel is stories about Daniel. The second half of Daniel is visions that Daniel had and wrote down. So the first half of it, the stories about Daniel, this is where we get Daniel in the lion's den. This is where we get the fiery furnace. This is where we get Nebuchadnezzar's dream and the madness of Nebuchadnezzar. Video on that soon, by the way. We get all these stories about Daniel. But these weren't the only stories about Daniel that circulated in antiquity. So the additions to Daniel found in the deuterocanonical versions of it contain more stories about Daniel. So these are Bel and the Dragon, Susanna and the Prayer of Azariah. The Prayer of Azariah is a prayer supposedly said by Daniel's three friends while they're in the fiery furnace. So it's basically situated within the story of the fiery furnace itself. The story of Bel and the Dragon is a story about Daniel confronting two, I suppose, antagonists in the story, the idol of Bel and an actual dragon, and proving them to be false gods. And the story of Susanna is really interesting. First, because it was circulated independently in the ancient world in some cases. So it was called the Book of Susanna sometimes, in some references. But I don't want to spoil it because it deserves its own video, but it's essentially a woman named Susanna is falsely accused by two of the elders of her own people, and she stands her ground and then in the end is saved by Daniel using some clever wordplay. It's very fun. Video on that coming sometime. Now, I'm aware that in some Slavic churches there are additional books of the Apocrypha, like Second Esdras and the like, but I'm not 100% familiar with how those canons work, so we're going to bypass those for the moment. I'm also familiar with the Ethiopian Bible, that it contains a variety of other books like Jubilees, Mepchion, and the Book of Enoch, of course, and all of that will probably deserve its own video at a later time as well, so we're sticking with the basics today. Well, basics. I do not know why, but I have an insatiable craving for chicken and waffles right now. I'm from Minnesota. I don't know where this comes from. I've had chicken and waffles once, but all I know is that I need to eat it within the next 20 minutes or I think I might die. So anyways, this was just a quick video on what the Apocrypha usually refers to. Again, people typically use it to refer to either this collection of books we talked about today, or to basically any book that doesn't belong in the Bible, even though it looks like it might, like the Book of Enoch or the Book of Moses or the Ascension of Noah or things of that nature. So I've got a lot more stuff like this coming out. If you'd like to see more of it, feel free to subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments, and make sure everybody has a great day, because I'm going to go get some chicken and waffles right now.